Would you say that these materials were chosen by you at a later time, developing out of your theory of sculpture? Yes, you see, they are clearly developed, and there were a lot of forerunners until I came to the simple decision to take such materials. And taking these materials, after my thoughts on the necessity of building a theory, I saw then the interesting relation they had to my biography. Were you surprised? No, I wasn't surprised, because I told you already that during my childhood I made such things instinctively, and from the creativity of a child, seeing the things in the same way as now. I worked with machines, one could say simply, that worked without fuel, without so-called physical energy, which would function with concepts. And now I'm slowly on the point to develop such machinery to work without physical energy, and as I can remember that already as a child I did the same thing. This made a significance in my life, that parallelism of past and future. How did you approach deciding to do a piece of art, or in a certain case, an action, which comes up to you before you start to do it? What do you know about it, and how do you proceed? I know a lot before I start an action. I know a lot about the necessity of the general idea of sculpture, but I don't know anything about the process in which the action will run. When the action runs, my preparation works because I'm prepared to do a thing without knowing where it goes. You see, it would be a very uninteresting thing. It would have nothing to do with art if it were not a new experiment for which I have no clear concept. If I had a clear concept of solving a problem, I would then speak about the concept, and it wouldn't necessarily be to make an action. Every action, every artwork for me, every physical scene, drawing on the blackboard, performance, brings a new element in the whole, an unknown area, an unknown world. So, I have never a clear concept of a performance. I only make a decision about tools, for instance, but I don't determine the run of the action, or the character of the action at all. I never make actions to make actions, as a kind of innovation in the art world, as a new style. But I must say that the nature of the actions is the possibility to arrive at an understanding of art, for the most part, was translated into an official modern art style, and again became restricted to the enclosure of an ivory tower. Reduced to a traditional view of art as a historical history as a history of formal innovations without being seen as a possibility to innovate the whole social body. You see that this is the dilemma in the art world. But I try to overcome that situation as much as I can. Nevertheless, the problem always reappears, and I am always confronted with the temptation of the system to destroy such an impulse. I'd like to ask you in terms of the people participating in your work, the audience, for example, when you want to refer to the audience interactions, or the audience in Europe or at the Guggenheim. A lot has been made out of the fact that people have to rely so much on verbal and written interpretations of your work in order to understand the symbols of the quality of the meaning behind it. This seems to me, in a way, to be a contradiction with the intention of reaching out across society. If that were true, then it would be a contradiction, but you see it isn't true. That is transported by a lot of unclear sources and unclear positions by people who are involved in this whole difficulty. Journalists, critics, art historians, they are all building up this misunderstanding that one must have interpretations for the phenomena of the production. It isn't true, simply it isn't true. Simply it isn't true. People could work without interpretation, and they still can work without interpretation, but perhaps this is also interesting. Let's stop on this point as so not to blur it out. I never preserved a tool or a part of my laboratory, one would say, to avoid the term artist, because this is already an allusion to a kind of traditional understanding in a restricted way, which wouldn't work on its own form or the relationship between form, material, and so on. Sometimes appears such a thing, and never such as a tool which doesn't work without interpretation. But I would never give it an example of my understanding of sculpture as a stimulating phenomenon to see something about the problems involved. So it is not necessary to have such an interpretation. One of the most important statements of the enlarged understanding of art is that not only materials formed or in the chaos, if necessary, has to do with sculpture. Let me read that again. One of the most important statements of the enlarged understanding of art is that not only materials, formed or in chaos if necessary, has to do with sculpture. Not only materials has to do with sculpture. That's what it is. A thought is that a sculptural process and the expression of the thinking forms in language is also art. The totality of humankind's creativity, beginning with feelings and thoughts and their expression, is a special material, a language material, for which you need your body and physical tools, your tongue, your larynx, your lungs, and the air, the sound waves, the ear of the other person, all have to do with the idea of sculpture in the future. There is on one side the physical consequence of the thought, the forms being realized in buildings, in architecture, and agricultural forms, in so-called sculptures, because they have a special form. They imply a special imagination rather than being only a repetition of the given. It is possible for people to see those tools, the result of a process. They can see, one could say, the hardware character of a process. But from this point, we should look at the source, where the sculptural process starts, and it is the thought, the thinking power, and its consequence, information, which means for me bringing form in material conditions. Already, when I speak, I need my own body, the physical flesh. It is a kind of clay to form into. I need my lungs, I need my tools here existing in my anatomy. I need my iPhone, I need the physical conditions of the other forms of life, in my brother or my sister. I must at once eliminate discussions, interpretations, misunderstandings, deviations of the problem. I have to put everything in this process to bring up as much as possible the germ, the point of development in such a special direction, to bring up a reasonable basis, whereas a new culture in the future could spring off of. So, that is the second part of the problem, that the language, the thinking of the problem is a more important sculpture, even in the end of the process existing in tools or in paintings, or in drawings, or in carvings. Now, this transcendent character of information in an invisible world gives us at that time, at the same time, the proof and clear knowledge that we are not only biological beings, material beings, but first spiritual beings, not existing on this planet, that we are only partly existing on this planet, and being involved in wood and felt and fat and iron and rubber or whatever resources of this planet. That is for me the reason to speak, and it is the dignity of the speech. Otherwise, if this phenomenon, this reality is not clear, then the consequences is that every speech is blah blah blah. No social power exists, everything is chaos. And the other consequence is, let them do what they do, let the government do what it wants to do. I go out, I go apart, and I try to survive during my lifetime, and every language, every expression of human beings is blah blah blah. If you don't find the necessity to speak, then surely the language is blah blah blah. That is why I stress the necessity to find clear epistemological reasons to go on with art, which begin in humankind's thinking powers to mold and to bring up the quality of what traditionally appears as the form of a thing, to impulse the world with a radical other understanding of culture. In the past, it was the special spiritual authority of the high priest, the leader or the pharaoh of the tribal collective. Chief of the tribe, then later was the capitalistic dependency on money power and state power, and now it has to deal with the world in which is built up by people's creativity. But this will only be possible if people get slowly clear about the power they have, which starts in the thinking, the molding character of the thought, and the transference is in language forms and other kinds of language, as is in artwork where sculpture in a special physical form means also language. One must not have such a limited understanding of language. That is for me the reason why I have to speak, and I have to speak more often than I do so-called artwork. You see, the complication is that I have to use something. I have to use a traditional determination of ideas, so that when I speak about art, I can only say that there are two kinds of art: the traditional art, which is unable to bring up art at all, or to change anything in society, or an ability of the joy for life. And then there is the other kind of art, which is related to everybody's needs and the problems existing in society. This kind of art has to be worked out at the beginning. It has to start from the molding power of a thought as a sculptural means. If this sculptural agent is not active in the beginning, it will never lead to the result in any physical form, or the physical form will only be a pollution for the world and only will enrich the whole rubbish of production we already have. That is my meaning.